I was 54 years old when I heard my boss describe me to a room full of executives as a fragile shadow. I had stepped out of the boardroom to retrieve the corrected budget packet he had forgotten to bring to his own meeting. The packet I had stayed until 9 o'clock the night before to prepare. I was walking back down the hallway, folders pressed against my chest, when I heard laughter through the glass wall. The kind of easy, comfortable laughter that comes from people who believe they are alone. Calvin's voice was the clearest. He had a way of speaking in meetings that was half performance, half declaration, and you could always hear him from a distance whether you wanted to or not. He said her name was not worth worrying about, that she was smart enough to be useful, but harmless enough to manage. He used the exact phrase, fragile shadow. He said I was easy to move around. The room laughed again, warmer this time, like he had said something clever. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 30 seconds. I looked down at the folders in my hands. The budget corrections on page 3 were mine. The vendor renegotiation summary on page 7 was mine. The production timeline adjustment on the back page, the one that had prevented a late delivery penalty of roughly $40,000 2 weeks earlier, was also mine. Calvin had not written a single line of what he was about to present. Through the glass wall, I could see the backs of heads nodding along. Marjorie, the CFO, was smiling the smooth and practiced smile she kept ready for moments like this. I straightened the folders. I walked back to the door. I knocked once, opened it, and handed Calvin his packet with a steady hand and a neutral face. 12 years of being dependable had made that kind of neutral face very easy to wear. My name is Evelyn Hart, and by the time I was 54, I had learned one thing with absolute certainty. The women who keep companies alive are almost never the ones who get quoted in the press releases. I was the senior operations director for a mid-sized manufacturing company on the outskirts of Columbus. The company made industrial components, operated 3 production facilities, maintained about 60 active vendor relationships, and employed just under 400 people. For 12 years, I had been the person who made sure all of those moving pieces moved in the right direction at the right time. I had smoothed vendor panics at 11 o'clock on Friday evenings. I had caught staffing gaps before they became production shutdowns. I had corrected budget projections before they reached the bank in a state that would have caused real concern. I had handled the kind of daily operational chaos that senior executives describe in broad strokes without ever fully understanding what it costs to prevent it. I was divorced. I was steady. I was, by almost any professional measure, very good at my job. I had also been around long enough to know that disrespect does not appear suddenly. It builds slowly in the background, one small erasure at a time, until one day it gets loud enough for the person being erased to finally hear it clearly. The boardroom glass was that moment for me. The laughter was that moment. The phrase fragile shadow was that moment. Not because the words were new, exactly, but because they confirmed everything I had been carefully not letting myself believe for years. I had spent 12 years being described as dependable, steady, loyal, and essential. Those are all words that sound like compliments. What they actually mean, in the particular context I was living in, was that I was welcome to do the work as long as I never insisted on being seen doing it. Fragile shadow. At least that one was honest. I walked back into the boardroom and set the corrected packet on the table in front of Calvin without saying anything about where I had been or how long it had taken. He took it with the small, distracted nod he used for things he considered beneath acknowledgement. He did not say thank you. Gratitude implies that someone else contributed, and Calvin had spent his career managing the impression that his contributions were sufficient on their own. For the next 40 minutes, I sat 2 chairs to his left and watched him present my work. Not in a way that could be pointed to cleanly. He never said these are Evelyn's numbers or this timeline was built by my operations team. He simply spoke in a way that assumed everything had originated with him, the way water assumes the shape of whatever container holds it, the vendor analysis, the cash flow correction, the production schedule. He walked through all of it with the confidence of a man who had read the document carefully enough to pronounce things correctly. Marjorie sat across the table with that smooth, cool smile. She had a way of looking engaged without fully committing to any specific piece of information, useful when you wanted to appear informed without being accountable for anything. When the meeting ended, Calvin asked me to stay behind. He called it cleanup, his word for the gap between promises made in meetings and the operational reality of delivering on them. He had promised 2 clients a production timeline adjustment that was, as he described it, aggressive but achievable. What he meant was that he had no idea whether it was achievable and wanted me to find out and make it true. I wrote down the details in my notebook. I said I would look into it. My face was steady and gave nothing away. I had become very good at that over 12 years. That evening I sat in my car in the office parking lot for longer than I usually did. I did not go straight home. I had learned over the years that bringing certain feelings into my apartment without processing them first was a way of filling a quiet space with noise that did not belong there. So I sat in the parking lot under the orange-yellow glow of the overhead lights and let myself go through what had happened. Fragile shadow. I said it out loud once, just to hear it in my own voice rather than Calvin's. There is something specific about being called fragile by someone who depends entirely on your strength. It has a particular quality to it, like being told you are unnecessary by the very machine you have been keeping running. It is not just insulting, it is inaccurate in a way that makes the insult worse, because you know, with absolute precision, exactly how inaccurate it is. I thought about the words people had used to describe me over 12 years at the company. Dependable, steady, reliable, essential. They were not unkind words. But I had started to understand, sitting in that parking lot with the folders on the passenger seat, that every one of those words described what I did for the company, not who I was or what I deserved. Fragile shadow was different only in that it was honest about what they saw when they thought I could not hear them. I was not fragile. I had never been fragile. I had been composed, which is something entirely different. Composed means you have decided, deliberately, what to show and what to hold back. It is a form of strength that looks like quietness. And people who mistake one for the other make a very predictable kind of error. I drove home, I slept well, I got up the next morning and went back to the office and did my job. But something in me had shifted into a different gear. The first real twist came exactly 1 week after the boardroom meeting. Calvin called a short all-staff announcement for a Thursday morning, which he framed as exciting news about the company's direction going forward. In 12 years, I had learned that the phrase exciting news from Calvin usually meant something that was good for Calvin and required careful translation for everyone else. He announced that the company was bringing on a new hire. A strategic innovation lead, he called the position. The title was so broad and so vague that it could mean almost anything, which I suspected was entirely intentional. He presented the new hire as a fresh perspective, someone who would help the company grow in bold new directions while building on the strong operational foundation already in place. The new hire was his nephew, Bryce. Bryce was 29 years old. I learned this from HR paperwork that came across my desk 2 days later. He had a business degree and had spent the previous 3 years at a startup that had not produced anything of measurable significance before quietly dissolving. His LinkedIn profile described him as a visionary problem solver with a passion for disruption. Calvin assigned Bryce to shadow me. That was the word he used, shadow. I noticed the word but did not comment on it. He said Bryce needed to understand operations from the ground up, and that learning from me was the fastest way to build that foundation. He said it with a tone that suggested he was giving me an honor. I smiled and said I would be happy to help Bryce get oriented. What I actually thought was considerably more specific and considerably less polished. But I had spent 12 years keeping my actual thoughts contained in professional packaging, and one more morning was not going to change that practice. Bryce showed up at my office door the following Monday with a large coffee and a wide, easy smile, and I showed him where the vendor files were kept. Within a week of Bryce beginning his shadow period, I noticed certain phrases appearing in his conversations that I recognized. Not similar phrases, the same phrases, word for word. I had a specific way of describing the relationship between production scheduling and vendor lead times that I had refined over years of explaining it to people who were new to operations. I used a sequence of 3 sentences that made the concept land clearly without requiring the listener to already know the technical background. I had said this sequence in front of Bryce twice during his first week. On Wednesday of his second week, I sat in a department heads meeting and listened to Bryce use my 3 sentences verbatim while presenting to a group that included Calvin and 2 board observers. He delivered them with the ease of someone who believed the thought had originated with him. Calvin praised him for bringing clarity to a complicated subject. He said Bryce had a real gift for making complex things accessible. I sat 2 chairs down with my own notes in front of me, containing the same 3 sentences in my own handwriting from 2 years before Bryce had ever set foot in the building. The following week, a process solution I had drafted for reorganizing our supplier approval workflow appeared in a presentation with a new design template and Bryce's name on the cover. The content was mine. The formatting was different. The credit was entirely his. Calvin described it as exactly the fresh thinking the company needed. What had started as professional hurt began changing shape in those days. It stopped being about whether I was respected and started being about something more concrete. It became about what I could prove and what I was choosing to record. It became about the gap between what was mine and what was being taken, documented in a language that did not depend on anyone's goodwill to be understood. I bought a second notebook. I started keeping better records. I had never thought of myself as someone who kept score. Looking back, I think the more accurate thing to say is that I had always kept records, because records are what organized people do, and I am an organized person. What changed after Bryce arrived was not my habit of documenting things, but my understanding of why it mattered. I started pulling together everything I had produced over 12 years that had never officially been attached to my name. Emails I had sent to vendors during emergencies. Emergency staffing plans I had written from scratch on short notice. Cash flow corrections I had made after Marjorie's financial projections fell short of reality, which happened more often than the executive team liked to acknowledge. Production delay incidents I had prevented through early intervention. Supplier negotiations I had handled while Calvin was in meetings about other things. The list was long. Much longer than I had fully registered while I was in the middle of living it. There's something strange about seeing your own work laid out in a document. When you are doing it, it feels like simply doing your job, one task at a time, each one connected to the next by the logic of what needs to happen. When you see it collected and organized, you start to understand the shape of what you have actually been building. I had been the structural support that held the visible parts of the company in place, not just contributing, not just assisting, actually providing the foundational stability that allowed Calvin to present himself as a capable leader without his leadership ever truly being tested. I was not bitter about this as I made the document. Bitterness is a feeling that belongs to people who are still hoping someone will notice. I was past hoping. I was building something useful out of clarity. I labeled the document carefully, saved it in 3 separate locations, and went back to work. The announcement about the restructuring came on a Monday morning in a meeting Calvin called with 48 hours of notice. He framed it as a forward-looking strategic initiative, which is the language companies use when they want a change to sound visionary rather than explaining what it actually involves. He said they were streamlining leadership layers for greater efficiency and agility. He said the company was entering a growth phase that required a different kind of operational structure. Then he called me into his office after the general meeting ended. He closed the door, which he did when he wanted a conversation to feel serious and personal without being either. He told me my role was evolving. He used the word evolving the way people use words when they want the listener to believe something being taken away is actually a form of progress. He said they were creating a new structure where Bryce would take on strategic operational oversight. A careful way of saying Bryce would be given authority over the parts of my job that appeared most impressive on an organizational chart. What remained for me would carry nearly the same workload with less title and less influence, packaged as a lateral adjustment. He offered me a reduced title, Associate Operations Director. He said it was still a significant role. I looked at him across his desk and thought about 12 years of budget packets, vendor negotiations, staffing emergencies, and cash flow corrections, currently keeping the company operational. I thought about Bryce presenting my 3 sentences to a room of executives. I thought about the chart he was describing, in which the person who built the engine was being asked to become part of the frame while someone else held the controls. I told Calvin I would need time to think about it. He seemed genuinely surprised that I did not immediately say yes. That surprise told me everything about how accurately he had been reading the situation. 3 days after Calvin's offer, Marjorie made a mistake. She sent an email to the wrong address. Or more precisely, she sent an email to a chain that she believed ended one address before mine, not realizing that I had been copied on the original thread 2 messages earlier and was still active in the recipient list. The email was between Marjorie and one of the board members. It was about me. She described my work history at the company as administratively excellent, which she clearly intended as a compliment of the limited kind. The kind that acknowledges competence while carefully defining it as small. Then she wrote something that I read 3 times before setting my phone down on my desk and staring at the wall for a moment. She wrote that I was emotionally dependent on the company and would likely accept the demotion without significant resistance, because I was too cautious to start over at my age. Too cautious to start over at my age. I turned 54 in March. I had 23 years of documented operational experience. I had managed vendor portfolios larger than some of the companies those board members had previously worked for. I had prevented financial losses, production shutdowns, and contractor disputes in ways that had never been fully understood by the people who benefited from the prevention. And the CFO of the company I had quietly held together for 12 years had written, in a message she did not mean for me to see, that I was too old and too scared to leave. The boardroom conversation had been careless, unguarded laughter from people who believed they were alone. This was different. This was a considered assessment, written down and shared between 2 people who were making decisions about my future based on it. I forwarded the email to my personal address and saved it. Then I called a number I had been sitting with for 5 days. Lena Rowe had been a vendor executive with one of our primary material suppliers when I met her 7 years earlier. She was sharp, straightforward, and had a way of cutting through complicated situations to the accurate center of them that I had always admired professionally. 3 years into our working relationship, her company experienced a significant supply shortage that created a crisis for several of its manufacturing clients, including ours. Calvin had been ready to terminate the vendor contract in a way that would have created serious problems for both sides. I had worked directly with Lena over 2 weeks to find a workable solution that kept the relationship intact and limited the operational damage on our end. We had stayed in occasional contact after that, not frequently. But when Lena reached out, her messages were always direct and worth reading. She had left the supplier company 18 months earlier to take a senior role at a competing firm, smaller than ours and privately held. I had noted the move at the time and not thought much more about it. She called me on a Thursday afternoon and asked if I had time for coffee. I said yes. We met the following Saturday morning at a small place near downtown. She arrived first and ordered nothing until I sat down, which I noticed and appreciated. She asked how things were going at the company. I said fine, in the way that sounds fine, but is clearly not. She told me she had been watching our company from the outside for several years, and that she had a clear sense of where the actual operational capability lived. Then she told me she had a position open. Chief Operations Officer. Real authority, she said. A real seat at the table. More money than I was currently making. I asked her why she was coming to me. She said because she already knew who had been keeping my company running, and she wanted that person working with her instead. I did not call Lena back the same day. I drove home from that coffee meeting and sat in my kitchen for 2 hours, thinking carefully before I did anything. This is my nature. I do not make decisions quickly when they are large ones. I think through the shape of a situation from multiple angles until I understand what each direction actually costs, and only then do I commit to a direction. By the end of those 2 hours, I had said yes in my own mind. I called Lena the following morning and told her I was interested in moving forward. We agreed on a specific start date, 6 weeks away. She sent the formal offer letter by the end of that week. I read it 4 times, had a friend who is an employment attorney review it once, and signed it on a Sunday evening at my kitchen table. Then I went to work the next morning as if nothing had changed. This is the part that took the most from me. Not the decision to leave, not the negotiation. The 6 weeks of showing up every day after I had already decided to go, continuing to do the work fully and carefully, while the people around me remained entirely certain they had the situation under control. Calvin continued to adjust the restructuring timeline, asking for my input on elements of the transition, while not realizing I was the one transitioning out entirely. Bryce continued presenting adapted versions of my work in weekly strategy sessions, while I continued showing up to those sessions and taking notes. Marjorie continued running projections that I could see were becoming progressively more optimistic in ways that would not survive contact with actual quarterly results. They each mistook my continued presence for agreement. Calvin mistook my calm for submission. Bryce mistook my professionalism for acceptance. Marjorie mistook my silence for fear. Those were very useful mistakes. So I let them keep making them, one day at a time, for 6 weeks. From my desk in those final weeks, I could see what was coming for the company more clearly than I could have seen it from any other position. This is one of the particular advantages of being the person who actually understands the operational structure of a business. You can see downstream consequences before they arrive, because you know which decisions are load-bearing and which are decorative. Calvin and Bryce and Marjorie were all very good at the decorative kind. The load-bearing ones were, and had always been, primarily mine. Bryce's strategic innovations were expensive in ways that had not been fully priced. He had restructured the supplier approval process using a framework he had sourced from a business publication, presenting it as original thinking, without understanding that the previous process had been deliberately designed around the specific relationship history of our vendor network. The new framework looked cleaner on paper and was slower and more brittle in practice. Marjorie had been smoothing difficult quarterly results with forward projections that assumed levels of growth the actual order pipeline did not yet support. Each forecast was technically defensible on its own. Together, they created a picture of financial momentum that depended on the next several quarters, performing significantly above what the historical data suggested was realistic. Calvin had committed to 2 expansion conversations with potential clients based on production timelines that Bryce had assured him were achievable. They were not achievable without operational support I had already planned to withdraw. None of this was going to crash the company in a single quarter, but the cracks were visible to anyone who knew where to look. And they were widening. The moment I stepped away, the person who had been quietly monitoring and managing those cracks would be gone. And the people left would not fully understand what they were looking at until the damage was already measurable. I kept my observations in a private document I saved only to my personal drive. I resigned on a Tuesday morning in mid-November. I had written the letter over the weekend, 3 drafts, each one shorter than the last. The final version was a single paragraph. It stated my last date of employment, thanked the company for the opportunity, and wished the team continued success. It contained nothing personal and nothing that could be interpreted as anything other than professional. I printed it and walked it to Calvin's office at 8:15, before most of the building had arrived. He was at his desk with coffee and his laptop open to what appeared to be a sports website. He looked up when I came in and shifted slightly in the way people do when caught doing something they would not call their morning activity. I handed him the letter. He read it. His expression moved through several stages, most of which had to do with recalculating assumptions he had not realized he was making. Then he set the paper down and looked at me. He said he was surprised. He said he thought I was still considering the revised role. He said he thought I understood the long-term value of the new structure, and that he had believed we were aligned. I told him I had given it careful consideration. He moved to what I recognized as the retention script. He mentioned stability, tenure, and the value of relationships built over many years. He suggested, with practiced softness that sounds like warmth but is actually pressure, that perhaps I was choosing something gentler at this stage of my career, something with less complexity. I let him finish. Then I told him the name of my new company. I told him my new title. I told him the 3 words Chief Operations Officer slowly enough to be certain he heard all of them. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. It was the first time in 12 years I had seen Calvin with nothing ready to say. I finished my final 2 weeks cleanly. I completed every active project I was responsible for, up to the point of handover, and documented the status of each one in detail. I put together transition notes that were thorough and organized. I did this not for Calvin's benefit, but because I had always believed that the quality of your exit says something about the quality of your character. And my character had nothing to do with how I had been treated. My last day came and went without ceremony. A few colleagues stopped by to wish me well. HR processed my paperwork. I cleaned out my desk, which did not take long because I had always been the kind of person who did not accumulate unnecessary things in a workspace. By my second week at Lena's company, the messages had started arriving. Former colleagues, not the executives, the coordinators, the plant managers, the people who had always known, in the practical daily way that people on the ground always know, who was actually responsible for keeping things moving. They sent messages framed as small and friendly. Someone needed a vendor contact number they could not locate in the system. Someone needed to know the timing protocol for a specific supplier's invoicing cycle. Someone had a question about a production schedule exception that had been handled a certain way for years without anyone having formally documented why. I answered none of them. Not because I was angry. I genuinely was not angry at those people. They were navigating a system that had just lost a significant amount of its invisible structure and did not yet understand what was missing. But answering those questions would have been a form of continuing to do my old job for free while my old company adjusted to the consequences of its own decisions. I had boundaries now. They were new and clearly defined, and I intended to keep them. Lena's company was smaller than the one I had come from. About 160 employees across 2 facilities, compared to nearly 400 at Calvin's company. The vendor network was more compact. The production volume was lower. The organizational structure was flatter and simpler in ways that made the whole operation easier to read clearly. What it had that Calvin's company did not have was leadership that understood the difference between appearing to run something and actually running it. On my 3rd day, Lena came into my office and sat down across from me. Not to check on a task or relay instructions. She asked me what I was seeing so far and what I thought the priorities should be for the first 90 days. She asked as if she genuinely wanted to know the answer and intended to do something with it. She told me she had not hired me to clean up after people who did not do their work. She had hired me to lead. She said it plainly, the way people say things when they mean exactly what they are saying and are not trying to soften it or make it sound more important than it is. I nearly cried. I did not, because I had the same steady face I had developed over many years of keeping my reactions professional. But there was something that moved inside me when she said those words, something that had been compressed for a long time under the weight of being useful without being valued. Respect has a specific physical quality when it arrives after a long absence. It does not feel comfortable the way something familiar feels comfortable. It feels startling, the way a room feels startling when someone opens a window and you realize how long the air had been still. I told Lena my honest assessment of what the priorities should be. She took notes, then she acted on what I said. That was the first week. Calvin called me 3 weeks into my new role. He opened with pleasantries, which was unusual for Calvin, who typically treated social warmth as something to deploy when he wanted something, and not at other times. He asked how the new position was going, and said he was glad things had worked out well for me, which was an interesting framing since he had not, as far as I could recall, done anything to make them work out well. We exchanged a few minutes of surface conversation. He mentioned the weather and a trade conference we had both attended the previous year. He mentioned that the company was doing well, and the restructuring was progressing as planned. Then he mentioned, in the casual tone he used when moving toward his real subject, that they were putting together a lender package and had run into complexity around historical operating assumptions. He said the context was specific enough that most people currently involved did not fully understand the background. He said there were certain things that probably only someone with my institutional knowledge would be able to clarify. He wanted free consulting, one framed as a friendly conversation between former colleagues, so no formal request would need to be made and no payment discussed. I waited a moment before I responded. Not for effect. I genuinely needed the moment to appreciate the full shape of what he was asking. He had called me a fragile shadow through a glass wall. He had given my job in pieces to his 29-year-old nephew. He had offered me a smaller title with the same workload and believed I would accept it. And now he was calling to ask if I would help him with his lender package. I told him that Bryce would certainly be the right person to handle anything strategy-related. I said it warmly. I told him I wished him every success. The silence that followed was clean and complete and genuinely satisfying. The call that changed the shape of everything came on a Thursday afternoon in my 8th week at Lena's company. It was from a client I recognized immediately. One of Calvin's largest accounts, a regional distributor that had been working with my old company for close to 9 years. I had managed the operational side of that relationship directly for most of that time. I knew their order patterns, their delivery preferences, their tolerance thresholds, and their contact people by name. They had reached out to Lena's firm and requested a meeting. Lena told me in her direct way that the client had asked specifically whether I was involved in operations at the new company. They had heard I had made a move. They wanted to know if Lena's firm could handle the scope of what they currently needed. We met with them the following week. I presented our operational capabilities clearly, without any reference to my previous employer or anything that could be interpreted as inappropriate. I simply showed them what we could do and how we would do it. They signed a contract with Lena's company 2 weeks later. It was the largest single-client contract Lena's firm had signed in 4 years. She told me that over a quiet dinner she arranged to mark the occasion. Calvin heard about it, of course. Word moves quickly in a small industry. He made comments to mutual contacts about what he called a breach of professional conduct. He used the word poaching. He described it as a betrayal. The client, when asked by a mutual industry contact about the move, described it differently. They said they had followed competence to wherever it had gone, which was simply sound business practice. Those two descriptions, Calvin's and the client's, sitting side by side, contained everything important about the difference between how Calvin understood the world and how the world actually worked. I did not respond publicly to any of Calvin's comments. I did not need to. By the end of my 3rd month at Lena's company, word had begun moving through the industry in the way that word always moves through mid-sized manufacturing circles, slowly and quietly at first and then all at once. My old company had missed earnings, not by a small amount that could be explained through a single quarter of market variation, by a meaningful margin that required a written explanation to shareholders that was notably more detailed than the usual performance update. The explanation cited supply chain adjustments and market timing and several other phrases that were technically accurate without being fully honest about what had actually happened. The 2nd quarter miss came 11 weeks later, and that one was worse. Bryce gave a public interview to an industry publication during this period, in which he described the company's challenges as temporary and attributed them to legacy operational structures that the new leadership team was actively modernizing. He used confident language and broad strategic framing. He said the fundamentals were strong and the trajectory was clear. I read the interview on a Tuesday morning at my desk. The legacy operational structures he was describing were the systems I had built. The challenges he was calling temporary were the consequences of removing the person who had been managing those systems without replacing the knowledge or the capability. Marjorie began publicly attributing the forecast misses to external factors and market volatility, which was partially accurate in the way that all useful distortions are partially accurate. The external factors she was describing had existed before my departure and had been navigated successfully because someone understood them at a practical operational level. Inside the company, I was told by former colleagues who stayed in occasional contact, the situation had a different quality. Bryce was getting louder as results got worse. Calvin was scheduling emergency sessions. The two coordinators who had been given pieces of my former role were exhausted and under-supported. The cracks I had watched forming from my desk were no longer invisible. In my 5th month at Lena's company, she called me into her office on a Monday afternoon and closed the door. Lena did not close her office door casually. When she closed it, the conversation that followed was one that she had already thought through carefully and wanted to have in a contained space. She sat across from me and placed a thin folder on the desk between us without opening it immediately. She told me she wanted to walk me through something before it became official and before it became public. She said she wanted me to hear it from her first, because my perspective on it was both professionally relevant and personally significant. She told me the company was in serious acquisition discussions. The target was a manufacturing business with operational infrastructure that aligned well with our growth plans, a client base that had strategic value, and a valuation that had become significantly more accessible in recent months due to some internal instability and missed performance targets. She opened the folder then and slid it across the desk. The company name on the top of the first page was the company I had worked for 12 years. I looked at the page for a moment without speaking. The financials were right there on the summary sheet. Valuation down significantly from where it had been 18 months earlier. Revenue growth projections that had not materialized. Leadership expenses that had not contracted proportionally. The outline of a company that had started coming apart after the person holding it together had left. Lena watched me read. She said she knew this was personal in ways that went beyond the business analysis. She said she was not asking me to pretend otherwise. She said she was asking me whether I was prepared to be part of the team that evaluated and managed this acquisition with the same clarity and professionalism I brought to everything else. I looked up from the folder. I said yes. I want to be clear about what the due diligence process actually looked like from the inside. It was not dramatic. It was not a collection of moments where I got to point at my former colleagues and describe the things they had done wrong. It was detailed, technical, careful work that involved reviewing public financial disclosures, participating in formal management interviews, and analyzing documented operational data, the way you analyze any company you are evaluating for acquisition. I did not get to invent problems. I did not need to. The problems were thoroughly documented in the company's own records, visible to anyone willing to read carefully and understand what they were looking at. The executive compensation structure had expanded during a period when the operational budget was under strain. Bryce's role had a salary that reflected what a successful strategic innovation position at a large growth company might warrant, not what a reorganized relabeling function at a struggling mid-size manufacturer should cost. The inventory management process he had restructured had introduced inefficiencies that showed up clearly in the handling cost data. Marjorie's forecasting methodology had consistent optimism bias across 12 consecutive quarters that was quantifiable. None of this was hidden. It was simply scattered across documents that no one had organized into a coherent picture. Organizing scattered information into a coherent picture was something I was professionally excellent at. I also participated in the management interview sessions. Calvin, Marjorie, and Bryce were all interviewed as part of the standard process. I was one of several people in the room during those interviews, but not the one conducting them, which was the appropriate and proper arrangement. I sat there and took notes and asked 2 questions during one session about production scheduling assumptions that turned out to be very relevant to the financial model. Neither Calvin nor Marjorie appeared to fully understand what the due diligence process was revealing as it was happening. Bryce understood even less. The acquisition meeting took place on a Wednesday in early March. Both companies were represented. Lena led our side. Her finance lead and the acquisition attorney sat with her, along with me, on her left. Across the table sat Calvin, Marjorie, their company attorney, and Bryce. Calvin made an attempt at warmth when I walked in. He said my name and nodded in a way that was meant to look collegial, as if we were 2 professionals meeting at an industry event, rather than 2 people sitting on opposite sides of a negotiation that had started, in a sense, in a hallway outside a glass-walled boardroom 2 years earlier. I nodded back and sat down and opened my folder. Marjorie made it through the first 2 hours of the meeting without addressing me directly. She directed her comments to Lena and to the attorneys, which was a clear indicator that she had not yet recalibrated her understanding of who I was in the current context. She still saw me as the person who had been 2 chairs to Calvin's left in their meetings, not the person who was now sitting across from her with a role that affected her professional future. That recalibration arrived somewhere in the 3rd hour, when a question came up about production capacity assumptions, and the attorney looked at me for the answer. I provided it clearly and specifically, with reference to the relevant documented data. Marjorie's expression shifted. Bryce barely looked at me the entire meeting. He spent most of the time looking at the table in front of him, or at Calvin, as if waiting for a cue that Calvin was no longer in any position to provide. I had not come back to gloat. I had not come back to deliver a speech about what had happened or demand acknowledgement of anything. I had come back with a professional role and purchasing power. That was different from gloating in every way that mattered. The acquisition closed 6 weeks after the initial meeting. The terms were not what Calvin and Marjorie had hoped for. The company's valuation had been reduced further during the final negotiation phase, when a deeper review of the inventory system identified structural inefficiencies that had not been fully captured in the initial documents. Several of the existing executive contracts were reviewed as part of the integration planning process, and it was determined that a number of senior leadership roles would be eliminated post-close. The lawyers called it redundant leadership. It was a precise and neutral term that described, accurately, the situation in which 2 organizations combining have more people in senior roles than the combined entity requires. Lena asked me to lead the operational integration planning. This was the appropriate assignment given my knowledge of both companies' operational structures. It was also, in practical terms, the assignment that meant I would be building the organizational chart for the combined entity, which included decisions about which positions continued and which did not. I spent 10 days on that plan. I built it the way I built every operational document, carefully, based on what the combined company actually needed to function well, rather than on what any individual might prefer the answer to be. I used the same framework I would have used for any integration of this kind. The plan identified 3 senior leadership positions at the acquired company that did not have functional equivalents in the new structure and would not be carried forward. Lena reviewed the plan with her board. They approved it without significant modification. The notices went out on a Thursday, which was the standard practice for that kind of communication. I was involved in reviewing the documentation before it was sent. My role in the process was formal and professional, and entirely within my authority as Chief Operations Officer of the acquiring company. The signatures required on the transition documentation included mine. Bryce found me after the final integration planning session. The session ended at 4:15, and the room cleared within 10 minutes. I was gathering my notes when he appeared in the doorway. Gone was the confident expression from his time as strategic innovation lead. Gone was the easy borrowed swagger that had made him so comfortable presenting other people's ideas in larger rooms. He looked like a man who had discovered that the confidence he had been carrying belonged to a set of circumstances that no longer existed. He said he needed a moment. I told him to come in and sit down, because I was not the kind of person who makes someone stand in a doorway for a difficult conversation. He sat. He said he had known the acquisition would affect leadership positions. He said he had not fully understood until the integration plan was shared what that would mean for his specific role. He said he understood now. Then he said something I had not expected, and I want to be honest about it, because honesty is what this account deserves. He said he knew what he had done with my work. He said he had told himself at the time that he was just doing what Calvin encouraged, presenting things in ways that made the department look innovative. He said he had understood, underneath that justification, that the ideas were mine. He said he was sorry. Then, he asked if there was anything I could do. I thought about his question before I answered. Not because I was deciding whether to help him, but because I wanted to answer honestly, rather than dismissively. I told him the integration plan reflected what the combined company needed, not personal decisions about individuals. I told him borrowed work has a shelf life, and that the useful thing he could do now was start building something that actually belonged to him. He nodded slowly and left. Calvin did not ask for a meeting. He did not send a message expressing regret or reaching out the way Bryce had reached out, however imperfectly. Calvin operated by a different internal logic. He had spent his career moving forward by treating whatever was behind him as scenery rather than history, and he seemed to believe this situation would operate the same way. What he did, on the last day he came into the building before the integration transition, was speak to me briefly in the hallway outside what had been his office. He told me I had been more strategic than he had realized. He said he had not understood until the acquisition was finalized that I had positioned myself deliberately to create this outcome. He said the whole thing felt like something I had been planning for a long time. His tone was not remorseful. It was accusatory in the specific way people become accusatory when they have finally accepted that they lost something and need to assign the loss to someone else's malice rather than their own decisions. He said this proved I had been resentful all along. He said the entire chain of events was something I had orchestrated to settle a score. I let him finish completely. Then I told him the truth in as few words as it took to say it accurately. I told him I had not destroyed his career. I had simply stopped holding it up. I told him the difference between those two things was the most important thing he had never been willing to understand about the 12 years we had worked together. He looked at me for a moment. Something moved in his expression that I could not fully name. It was not guilt, exactly. It was something closer to the specific discomfort of knowing that something someone said to you is true and has been true for a long time. He turned and walked away. I went back to work. I signed the notices on a Thursday afternoon in a quiet office in the building that was now, legally and operationally, part of Lena's company. The rain had been coming down steadily since noon. The kind of rain that makes the inside of a building feel contained. I had a cup of tea at my elbow that had gone cold. The documents were organized in the order I would process them, which is the way I have always approached paperwork. I did not feel triumphant when I signed. I want to say that clearly because it matters. Triumph belongs to a story where the goal was always the defeat of specific people. That was not the story I had been living. The story I had been living was about what happens when you stop accepting other people's definitions of your value and start building something according to your own understanding of what you are worth. Calvin's notice was processed first, practical rather than symbolic. He was the most senior executive affected. Marjorie's followed. Bryce's after hers. By noon, all three were gone. By Monday, I was standing in the boardroom with the glass wall. The same room where Calvin had called me easy to move around and the table had laughed. I stood at the head of it now, leading the integration kickoff, with a team from both companies that was now one organization. I had not chosen that room as a statement. It was simply the largest available space, and the meeting required it. But I noticed the glass wall. I noticed the morning light through it. I noticed where I was standing relative to where I had stood the day I walked back in with the corrected packet and a neutral face. And I understood what shadows actually are. They are proof that something solid was standing there the whole time. The light does not create the shadow. The solid thing does. The solid thing was always me. I opened the meeting and got to work.